Welcome to the Two Blokes Chatting radio show on 94.7 The Pulse. Music, interviews, news, and, well, Two Blokes Chatting. Now, here are the two blokes.
Now, Rob, what we like to do is we normally play one of the greatest hits of the person we're about to interview, and I've got one lined up here, which is my favourite piece of audio, with a little bit of a reminder to the Geelong folk about where your coach came from.
Number 22, Chris Scott.
You had to get Brisbane in there somewhere.
Justin Lemons.
Oh dear.
It's a very familiar voice, and my favourite of all, 23, Justin Lepich. Craig Willis, good morning to you.
Good morning, fellas. I'll be with you on Two Blokes Chatting.
Thank you for being part of it. That takes me back to a very happy day in 2001 where you were standing in the middle of the MCG and I was standing in the grandstand crying. Very, very special moment for me. I've got a vague recollection you might be a Lions man.
Indeed, and I think the most lasting memory for me was that great shot of Kevin Murray.
Yes, that's what took me over the edge.
In the stand. And I just thought that day, that encapsulated the entire moment of 2001. And then, of course, there was 2002, 2003.
We got bored after that.
Settle, boys. Keep a lid on it, please.
Craig, thanks for taking some time out of your Saturday morning. We know you spent a lot of time talking into microphones and telephones over the journey, so to do that for us on a Saturday morning is very much appreciated. Take us back to when it all started. When did you realise you had a voice that was going to be usable as a career?
I think I was at preschool kindergarten, actually.
You had a voice like this in preschool, didn't you?
It was there, and I always had to get into radio as a young kid. I used to have, I grew up in Sydney, and my parents had the old Valve AWA wirelesses around the house, and I used to tune into distant stations and do all that sort of stuff. And I thought, I would like to get into radio. And there was a fellow in Sydney that used to give what were then known as voice coaching lessons to aspiring young radio people. And I rang him, and he said, I can tell instantly over the phone, dear boy, you have no chance whatsoever. I would have loved to have run into this bloke later on. But anyway, and then I had a job offer with the St George Bank in Sydney to dress up as the Dragon.
Wow. In
their promotions department. But then I was given a cadetship at Repco to work in the automotive business, which I was very pleased about. But my mother had sent for what were then called dispatch boys at George Patterson's advertising agency at 252 George Street. So I applied for that job and got it. And I started on the same day as a bloke called Les Gock, who was the lead singer of Hush.
I was going to say, yes.
Because went on to become an icon of Australian rock music. And Hans Torv, who at the time was Rupert Murdoch's brother-in-law, as his sister Anna was married to Rupert Murdoch. So the three of us started on the same day. And funnily enough, we've kept in contact pretty much ever since. That was 1973. Then one of my jobs was to deliver tapes, of this digital business, to 2UW in Sydney, in Kent Street. And there was the operations manager, a bloke called Roger Summerall, said, we're looking for an office boy. I said, can I apply? He said, yes. And I got the job there. And I was working, John Lawley there at the time, demo tapes as we called it. And unbeknown to me, Laws had sent one off to 2LT Lithgow, and that was my first station.
And Lithgow in those days would have been in the middle of nowhere. It's 2.5, 3 hours out of Sydney?
Correct. It was in an old house on the highway. It was as cold as a mother-in-law's kiss. But I did 2 shifts there in those days, 2 till 4 in the afternoon, and then 7 till 11 at night. But I worked with young, what's his name? I just had a quite lapsed there. Craig Denyer, who's Grant, of course, we know, but Craig Denyer and another great radio man, Peter Graham, was at 2LT at the time. So, and then from there I went to Tamworth, then to Canberra, spent a couple of years there, to Wagga, and then to Sydney, to T, and then to Melbourne to 3UZ as it was in those, and then to 3AW. So that's
3UZ was that back in the Bert Newton days, and would that have been the Fitzroy connection?
Well, that was part of it, but we had Tony Barber was the breakfast announcer. Bert Newton. I worked with Martha Gardner in the afternoons.
Wow.
Did racing coordination. Worked with Father Gerard Dowling, who celebrates 50 years on air this year as the family counsellor. But with John Deeks, George Daines, Sean Cosgrove, Steve Murphy.
Goodness me. Hang on while I pick all these names up, Craig.
Peter Byrne, of course, the Geelong man, was there as well. Bert Bryant, John Russell, Brian Martin, calling the races, Brian Markovic. Ronnie was calling the Greyhounds, Pete Donegan with the Greyhounds and the Hussies. And then, of course, to go non-racing format and become friends of the family. And I was offered a job at 3AW to work with Darren Hinch. So I spent 5 years working with him on air at AW. So that was an interesting time in my life, and we're still very firm friends to this day.
I guess the thing that saddens me about hearing that story, Craig, is, you had in those days the 2LTs of the world and you were able to work your way up through. These days it seems to me, and I know this sounds like I'm getting old and all that kind of stuff, but these days, if you are fortunate enough to get a gig in a country station, you will not only be the breakfast announcer, because that's the only program they actually do, but you'll also be the sponsorship manager, sales manager, office manager, everything else. It doesn't sort of seem to me that there's that pathway anymore for broadcasters as distinct from personalities.
You couldn't be more truthful in that saying. When I started, we think. You were on air, you visited clients, you turned the transmitter on, you turned the transmitter off, you swept the studio, you cleaned the records that we played in those days. And I used to do some work, and you mentioned a good mate of mine off there in Cova with the radio school that was running at Swinburne. And Jim used to get me to come and have a little chat to the students, and I'd say to them, this is where you'll get your grounding. It doesn't matter where you are in country radio, that's where you'll get do your apprenticeship there. You'll read desk notices. You'll read electricity outage notices. And you might think it's strange, but that's where all your grounding will come. And the thing is that you'll all aspire to come and work in metropolitan radio, but after a couple of years, you probably want to go back to the bush. That's where you'll have more fun working in radio. These days, it doesn't matter whether your voice is any good or not. You're a comedian, a social influencer, but it seems that the market's just wide open for radio programmers to go, oh, gee, this is seriously what annoys me. Gee, they've got a lot of followers on Instagram. Let's give them a job on air.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem to ring true to me, but I'm like, I can say it, old-fashioned in regard to that sort of way of doing that pathway program into radio, rather than somebody going, oh, gee, they look good or they sound good, let's get them on the wireless. It just doesn't work.
Well, Rob and I, it's fair to say, have both got a 6 as the first digit in our age, and we haven't given a hope yet of getting a commercial gig at some stage, albeit in the middle of the night, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. But these days, if we want to be a proper radio announcer rather than community radio like we're doing, we've really got to get on to Big Brother, don't we?
Something like that, or Married at First Sight.
Yeah. And you've obviously never seen either of us, so it's unlikely we've been on the second of those two.
Beauty and the Geek would be my best option, I think. No, it is very sad, because there's been some wonderful people have come through and tell similar stories of you, Craig, of doing the hard yards, if you like, early, having good mentors and role models, being prepared to do the grotty stuff early until an opportunity breaks. But some very talented people have come through that pathway. We had Greg Evans on recently, and I hadn't realised that his career started in Colac, and similar stories to you, and going different places to get his craft better, which you clearly did, and have benefited greatly from it.
Well, Greg lives not far from me. we had him up for morning tea not long ago, he and Sue, and we were reminiscing because he was the breakfast announcer at 2KA Katoomba when I was starting at Lithgow, and his director of 2KA was Keith McGowan, so back to 1973 again. But Greg's a great fella, and he's doing marriage celebrancy now. He's done over 1,000 weddings.
Yeah, and in fact, obviously, as I approached you via your website, I approached Greg via his website, and the question that you on your form it says comments or inquiry or something. He's got, when do you want to get married? I went back with my comment was, I don't.
I don't, but the footy thing, Craig, it's the one that everyone knows you best. You have a voice that is just synonymous with our great Australian game, and interestingly, you're a Sydney fella, so you're late to being part of the tribalism that is Australian rules footy. But how did the door open for you to get that MCG gig, which you've just made your own?
Well, it came about when Collins went to the AFL, manager of football operations, and I was working at the tennis with Channel 7. And the league wanted to make some changes in the way things were done, and Colo's secretary rang me and said, could you come and see Ian when the tennis finishes, which I did. And my boss at Channel 7, Gordon Bennett, said, I think it would be very beneficial if you went and saw him. So Colo said, we'd like you to come on board as our sort of MC, ground presenter, whatever. But of course, it tied in beautifully with the fact that Channel 7 were the broadcaster, and I was only a freelance operator with 7 at the time, but that sort of melded in well, if you like, between the two of them, and that's how it started. So it was 1993, so going back to those days, and went on for over 25 years. It was a terrific part of my career.
We've had a couple of conversations with Mike Brady, and he talks about his current workload, which is pretty much mid-August to the end of September is about 90% of his annual income, and I'm sure you do a lot more. But as far as football followers go, you, like Mike Brady, just own the finals September action that the AFL is now.
Yeah, well, actually I do a program with 3 and 2 called Great Australian Lives, and I had Mike Brady as a guest a few months back. And it's interesting, I think one of my questions to him at the time was, how many times a day have you sung up there because during grand final week? Just pick one day. And I think he said one day there were 6 different functions that he went to just to sing one song.
Yeah.
He said it's always regarded as his superannuation. He's a great fella, Mike. But I remember the year that they didn't want him in the grand, and there was an uproar for the fact that he wasn't going to be. And during COVID, this all sort of died off a bit. But then, of course, he was back doing it, which is just terrific because the crowd love that sort of thing. To get him up there and singing up there because it really, it's sort of the anthem of footy, if you like.
Am I right in saying during COVID they actually got him to go to the MCG and stand in the middle of the MCG and record it so they could use it at one of the grand finals?
His own. yeah, on his own.
Yeah.
And he said to me later, he said, it was the most amazing feeling. And look, to be honest, and if you're lucky enough, and I have been lucky enough, to stand out on that ground when there's no one there, it's just like unbelievable feeling. And when it's crowded, you just don't really have time to take it all in because you're trying to concentrate on actually what you're doing. But to stand out there and just look around, you go, good Lord. I'll tell you a very quick. We had Ed Sheeran in town, and my partner Donna and I went to see him, and I was telling the story of the year that he came to sing at the grand final, and I think it was the same year that Tom Jones was there. Anyway, it was a Thursday before the grand final. It was a very warm day, actually quite hot, and they said, can you go down to the dressing room thing under the Great Southern Stand? There's a young bloke down there with a guitar. Can you bring him out to the stage? I said, yeah. So we walked out, chatting away. Lovely fellow, and it was quite hot. And I said, come on, we'll sit under you keep out of the sun. You'll get burnt, if you being a carrot top and all that sort of thing. And I said, do you have a band with you? He said, no, it's just me and the guitar and everything else. And then one of the girls from the production came over. She said, we'll be a few minutes. And she said, have you met Craig? He said, yeah, we're chatting away. And I said, I'd like to be introducing you on the day. And the grand final day, and he said, "Oh, that's good." And we're talking about England and it's coming out to Australia. I had no idea who he was. and when I did the rehearsal thing, I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ed Sheeran." And he sang something and he came up, "Oh, I love you. This is not bad." And I was sitting at the MCG with Donna and I'm saying to her, "Do you reckon he'll ring me and ask me to come down and introduce him?" Yeah, but there's 107,000 people here, you idiot.
And he'd have to have a number on his back, wouldn't he, surely? Because most of the introductions you've done at the MCG have been preceded by their jumper number.
Well, we'd have to give it. We have some steers at the farm that Donna looks after, and at the moment, Sean Burgoyne, number 9's gone missing.
Oh, no.
The fence in the next door paddock, so we keep going up. It's electrified, so he's number 9, Sean Burgoyne.
That does get a run fairly frequently on a radio station not very far up the road from here, and I think actually the man on that program might even be listening this morning because he's got a property down our way, as you know. So, but 23 Justin Lepich has always been my favourite and will continue to be so until the day someone calls out number 8, Will Ashcroft. That will be the day that Lepper gets put into the bucket.
Well, yes. Yeah, well, he's done his knee, I think, Will, hasn't he?
Yes, he has. And as I mentioned to Cove,
yeah,
the Geelong Advertiser reported that the next day as Geelong lost their momentum when Will Ashcroft went off with a knee complaint.
A pretty serious knee complaint. Hey, Craig, we do know that Dennis Cometti did a lot of rehearsal for his commentary, which was sharp, witty, but not always necessarily off the cuff. When you see the lineup of potential names that you're going to be reading out at the end of the grand final, do you look at them and think, "Oh, yeah, I'll have a bit of fun with that one"?
Not really. It's a pretty nerve-wracking time, as you can imagine, that you're out there at the behest of basically being run by Channel 7, but you've got the AFL to take into account, and the gap between the end of the grand final and the presentations is, well, it seems like it's an hour, but it is a long time. So all you're really thinking about is not stuffing up the names and getting the order wrong. But we're lucky. The tennis has always been a challenge because new players coming along and you just have to go and find out how to pronounce their name. Even the people on the WTA or the ATP, the men's tour, wouldn't have a clue how their names are pronounced, so you'd have to go to the player and usually in the player restaurant and say, "Excuse me, how do you pronounce your name?"
Roger Federer. How else would you say it?
Yeah, although I did hear him called Federer once.
It sounds like a hat.
You've got to be very clever to make sure that you do get it right. But most of them are very cooperative about doing something like that. Footy players are easy.
Yeah, there haven't been too many challenging ones, have there?
No, not too much at all.
Nico was, I think, one. Dibber was one that used to always get me until I forgot one day.
Yeah, well, there was a bloke who used to play at Port Melbourne and Frankston whose name eludes me momentarily, but there was about 17 different ways you could put the emphasis on his surname, and I used to get it wrong every time, and it would be different 15 times during the call of the game. It was a shock. I can't remember his name, but it was an absolute shock. I used to dread doing Frankston games for that reason.
We've had one of the greats of the game retire recently, probably not on his terms necessarily, and I refer to Buddy Franklin. I guess, Craig, you've been doing it a long time, so at some stage you're going to not be doing it. Are you at that point where you're going to be clever enough to tell Channel 7 as opposed to them telling you?
No, I still do a little bit with them. I basically do the promos for 3AW and 6PR in Perth, do a lot of work with the racing station over there, Tab Radio Racing and Sport. But yeah, no, look, you just tootle along in this business, and you always know that one day they'll tell you to go and hang up your coat. But no, I just keep tootling along, doing my best.
Do you think that, would you like to be able to say to them, look, I've had enough, or are you happy that one day they'll tell you and then you'll know?
Well, I'm not doing as much as I used to anyway, so I'm sort of semi-retired, living in Mansfield and on the farm up there. So, I do most of the stuff I do is remotely these days too. As you know, with technology, you don't really have to be anywhere.
I've just let the cat out of the bag that you're not in the studio, Craig. We were going to build up the fact that it was great to see you and not, and you've just blown that out, haven't you?
Well, had I known, we could have done it by Zoom.
But again, you then understand why we haven't been asked to be on Married at First Sight.
Oh, dear.
Craig, it has been absolutely sensational to catch up with you. When you mentioned you've got your program on 3MP, we don't mind promoting other stations for our friends. When can people hear Great Australian Lives?
That's at 6 p.m. Sunday nights, and my guest this week is another old mate, Rob Sitch, from Working Dog Productions.
And they're
Um,
just finished another Utopia, which is hilariously funny, but it makes you cry with the reality of it. But they are very, very clever, that crew. They've done some amazing stuff.
I did make the point with Rob that satire imitates true life at the moment with not only Utopia, remember the series they made about Canberra.
Yes.
Australia. That was 15 odd years ago, that series, but it's again.
Oh, and front line with Mike Moore.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
That was very good, yes.
and of course our mutual mate, who we hope is listening, Ross Stevenson, with the games. How that was written about 3 years before the Sydney Games, and it actually turned out to be a documentary rather than a mockumentary.
And the games are still on ABC iView, as indeed is the first series of Utopia.
And I've got a feeling that a very young Ross Stevenson pops up in one of the episodes of the games as a Bulgarian wrestler or weightlifter or something.
Weightlifter, yeah.
I think it was something like that, but what a brilliant series, and God, don't we miss John Clark.
We most certainly do, yeah. And I think that sort of work that he did, that will never, ever go out of fashion. It was just superb stuff.
Who could forget the great Farnarkler?
Now, Craig, before we let you go, we've just received a text from a listener. His name is Ross, and he's listening from a town not very far away from here, and he said, "Good morning, I'm listening." So all the very best to you from that man as well.
And thank you, Roscoe. And he did attend a very pleasant little lunch that was put on for me for celebrating 50 years in wireless, and just come in from London that morning. I was very touched that he was up to join us to celebrate, and thank you to the team at Tobin Brothers for taking me out to lunch with Donna, and we had a lovely afternoon with Sean Cosgrove and a few of the other, Matty Hill, the race caller, just to celebrate 50 years on the wireless.
Well, now that you're officially a friend of the Two Blokes Chatting, we look forward to catching up with you over a beer when you celebrate your 60th year with the wireless. We hope to be there for it.
Let's hope we make it. Well, it's great to talk, and you're down your way. I'll say go Cats. I sent Tom Hawkins a message. He's lying around doing nothing. He can come up and help me move the steers in the car.
And he would love that.
But meanwhile, it's Go Lions in the West tomorrow. Thanks for your time, Craig. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Craig. Best wishes.
Okay, all the best.
Thanks. There he is, Craig Willis, the voice of footy, the voice of tennis, the voice, really.
Yeah, and again, every time we've had someone of that ilk on, we learned a lot more about their life than we expected. I just presumed he was probably a carpenter that had a really good voice, and someone from Channel 7 heard him, said, come and do the stuff at the MCG. You've got a really good voice, but there it is, 50, well, in that case, 20-odd years of preparation, working at umpteen different radio stations, just finding a pathway to whatever, and the whatever turned out to be accidental.
Now, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've only got to hang out another 5, and someone might discover me.
Yep.
Excellent. All right. Well, we've got enough people. Okay. Ross is just hopping out of the car now to buy beer. Thanks for dropping a note, Ross, as well.